Hello, I'm Tom Gosling, Executive Fellow at the European Corporate Governance Institute, and I'm here today with Claudine Gartenberg, Assistant Professor of Management at Wharton. This is a slightly unusual episode because, as regular viewers will know, we normally discuss a recent paper from the ECGI Working Paper Series, but I met Claudine when she was a keynote speaker at the ECGI Conference on Corporate Purpose at Copenhagen Business School in September, where she presented findings from a collection of her work on corporate purpose. And it was such a good presentation, I asked her if we could capture highlights from that in an interview for the Conversations series. So slightly unusually, we'll discuss three papers today, which are Corporate Purpose and Financial Performance with Andrea Pratt and George Serafim, Corporate Purpose in Public and Private Firms, authored with George Serafim, and then the contingent relationship between purpose and profits, where Claudine is the sole author. And we'll put links to all of these papers in the show notes. So Claudine, thanks for taking on the epic challenge of summarizing your body of work in the 20 or so minutes we have today.
Thanks so much for having me. I will try to talk quickly.
Well, actually, given that we're going to talk about three papers here, we might allow ourselves to go a little bit beyond my normal time limit. But let's start off with some definitions. So in your work, what do you mean by corporate purpose, and how do you measure it?
So that's actually a really great question, because one thing that I've learned from doing work on this for now about a decade is that there are many different definitions of purpose. And often people think that they're talking about the same thing, but they're actually talking about purpose in slightly different ways. And that tends to confuse the discussion on purpose. So the way that we've talked about purpose in our papers is the meaning of a company's work or firm's work beyond financial measures of performance, or beyond quantitative measures of financial performance. And so when you think about what that means, what are we put on the planet to do? What are we here to accomplish? It's really what CEOs mean when they talk about corporate purpose. And so you hear a lot about purpose these days. CEOs are talking about it. Investors are talking about it. And a lot of that is the way that we think about it. And I talk about it sort of as the inside out view of purpose, what companies are trying to achieve. And that contrasts with a slightly different view of purpose, which is, you can think about it sort of, what is the purpose of the corporation? And that is, a lot of academic discussions are actually thinking about that flavor of purpose, which is, what is the objective of the corporate form? For who does the company serve? And both use the word purpose, and they intersect a lot. The discussions and the debates intersect a lot. One is almost more of a policy perspective. What is this corporate form here to do? The way that we think about it is, keeping all the policy debates constant. When companies talk about what their purpose is, how does that manifest? So that's how we think about purpose, this sort of the meaning of a company's work beyond quantitative measures of financial performance. Now, that's a definition. Measurement is a completely different ball of wax. So how do you go about measuring this? And so the obvious way that you would want to start is, okay, what does the company say their purpose is? What does the CEO say? What do the company filings say? What do they say when they're being interviewed by investors or in the press? And what we found with that is, it's really problematic, because there's a big cheap talk problem in this business, right? It's really tempting, to say, we are, a purpose. I've actually seen a billboard, purpose-driven dog food. It's like, what is purpose-driven dog food? Or I've actually seen another ad for purpose-driven checking accounts, purpose-driven salads, purpose-driven, so there's so much cheap talk in this area that as researchers, as empirical researchers, we just don't trust any of that stuff. We're very cynical about that. We're cynical about what companies say. So then, you step back and you say, well, this is clearly something that's real. It's important for companies, but but how do you get a credible measure of it? And so the way that we've solved this problem, and I don't want to say solved because it's not perfect. I don't think there's any perfect way of doing this, but I think you can build up sort of many different ways, and eventually they'll all sort of converge to a picture. So the way that we've approached this is, we say, we can't measure purpose on its own. It's something that's intangible and immeasurable. But what we can do is measure a signal of purpose through aggregate employee beliefs. So if the employees themselves, who are really an informed stakeholder group, if the employees themselves believe that their work on aggregate has meaning and impact, then there's something that company is doing to instill a sense of purpose. So we rely on a really large archival survey of employees that asks questions about all aspects of the workplace, and that's beneficial because then we can strip out other beliefs related to other things. So we rely on an employee set of survey to say, on aggregate, if employees on average believe that their work has meaning and impact, then that company is actually doing something to instill a sense of purpose.
Very interesting, and I think actually this distinction that you make between the two definitions of purpose is particularly helpful, I think, at the start of this discussion, because I think a lot of corporate leaders scratch their heads a little bit at some of the academic debates around the purpose of the corporation, but the way you're defining it is a way that is absolutely relevant to the sort of day-to-day work of corporate leaders looking to instill a culture in their organization.
I think that's right. And I just want to quickly point out, so it wasn't actually the person who's written really interesting things about that is Ed Rock at NYU. So he talks about these sort of 4 cross debates that we as academics are having that are a little bit talking past each other. So we sort of are part of this managerial debate. Then there's sort of this debate on objective the corporation. And so I'd point the listeners to Ed Rock's work, who's really written deeply, I think, about some of these sort of debate and definitional issues on purpose.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, no, thanks for that. So in your paper, Corporate Purpose and Financial Performance, you find particular aspects of purpose that are associated with financial performance, and that's this sort of purpose and clarity combination. Can you just talk through your headline findings?
Yes, absolutely. So first, I just want to say from a methodological perspective, and I don't want to get too much in the weeds here, but it's important to point out, when you're doing studies using employee surveys, it's really problematic to just take aggregates of the survey items that you like the most, because there's so much correlation between all of these. If you're a happy employee, you're going to rate all your stuff pretty high. And if you're not a happy employee, you're going to rate all aspects of your workplace pretty low. And so the correlation between these survey results is really challenging to do good empirical research using survey data. So what we did is we went to our social psych colleagues at NYU first, which is where I was when I started this, and essentially one of the best practice here is you want to run a factor analysis on these surveys. So you want to figure out the latent factors that covary with each other, because those are the distinct set of beliefs that employees hold. And so when we run a factor analysis on the survey, what we find is that the purpose-related beliefs actually covary with 2 sets of beliefs. So there's 2 factors related to purpose. One factor we called a purpose camaraderie, and that is you feel that your job on aggregate has a deep sense of meaning, and you feel that there's a strong sense of collegiality in your organization. So that's our purpose camaraderie belief. Then we find that there's another set of bundles of beliefs. That's all your purpose-related beliefs, but they also covary with what's called clarity, which is that I feel a deep sense of meaning in my job, and I have the tools and resources, and I know the direction of where we're going. And so those are 2 distinct factors. What we found is that purpose camaraderie beliefs have no relationship to financial performance, but purpose clarity beliefs do, and they need to be together as a bundle. So purpose beliefs on their own don't predict financial performance. Clarity beliefs on their own do not predict financial performance. The bundle of those beliefs together, that's what predicts strong financial performance.
I mean, there's something quite intuitively satisfying about that, but it's really interesting that your data, that's what came out of your data. And the really striking aspects of the findings was the importance of middle management to the association of performance, the often maligned middle management. So can you talk us through this and how you might explain that?
Yeah, the poor middle managers. I worked in consulting for about 10 years before I went into academia, and man, it is a tough job, and it's an important job.
And they always get blamed for being a permafrost and all of this.
They get blamed, and they never get the credit, and the whole it is a tough role in the organization. So the nice thing about using these employee surveys to construct these beliefs is then you can disaggregate them. And so exactly what you talked about, you can construct purpose beliefs at the hourly level, you can construct purpose beliefs at the middle manager and salary level, at the executive level, the sales level. And that's what we did in this study, where we split apart purpose into the different hierarchical levels. And we said, which one is driving this positive relationship with performance? And what we found is that it was this middle layer that is really driving that has this positive predictive role in future financial performance. So hourly beliefs if you have employees, this is, a little bit of a bummer for those of us that want to advocate for employees, but the data is what the data is. Strong sense of purpose among your hourly employees has no predictive power on financial performance. Interestingly, the executive level, if anything, it's negative. It's weakly negative, which is the stronger your executives feel this, it's that has 0 to negative predictive power of financial performance, but it's at that middle layer that link really matters.
And how do you, what's your sort of explanation for this? How do you rationalize?
Yeah, so I'm my basic training, the way that I approach these types of things is as an organizational economist. So I think of this as an incentive issue. That's how we explain it in the paper, which is a little bit of an instrumental explanation, but I think it's generally right, which is that you have a real incentive issue at this middle layer. Which is, so the hourly layer, the hourly level, right? You have hourly wage rates, you have piece rates, it's fairly easy to incentivize your workforce. I don't want to oversimplify it, but that's sort of the incentive problem there. At the executive level, the incentive issue, you grant, some type of long-term incentive comp in the
and
company.
Stock price makes sense as an incentive at that
exactly
level.
Because that's what they have control over. At this middle layer, they play a really crucial role in the organization. There are sort of information channels up and down the organization. They connect. They have this very strong relational role in the organization, both for innovation, for coming up with ideas, but it's a non-contractable role. It's very hard to say, come to this organization and really, be this information connector and source of innovative ideas and, enact the strategies. It's a hard incentive issue with this middle layer, but it's a really important layer in the organization. And so in the paper, we discuss how, in this case, you can sort of replace the extrinsic motivation with intrinsic incentives. If we really believe what this organization is doing, if we're really committed to this, the mission of it, then those are the organizations that are going to be successful.
That's a really fascinating explanation. I guess an obvious response to the findings that purposeful firms perform better is that it's all just reverse causality, and that firms that are performing better have more time and resources to spend on self-indulgent things like developing a corporate purpose. And how confident can you be about the causal explanation?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important question. And as you said, you can sort of think of this as a luxury good, right? Like our company, we're raking in the money, so we must be doing something super important for the world. Like, we're not just making money, we're, we're a social media company that's connecting everybody together, or we're, and so it's a really plausible interpretation of our results. And it's one that we took really seriously in the paper. It's one that we also don't have a perfect instrument for, because, so I'm in the management department here at Wharton, strategy. And pretty much every question that's interesting in our world is endogenous. And so what we do here is we say, look, we don't have a perfect way of disentangling this, but we can provide a myriad of evidence that altogether is pretty consistent with a causal explanation, and you'd have to sort of tie yourself up in knots to give the reverse causal explanation. And that's kind of how we approach it in the paper. So when you think about it from a, First of all, the link is at our middle layers. So if you really think it's a reverse causal explanation that we're doing really great and really wonderfully, and so then we feel a sense of purpose, then you'd really think the link would either be at the executive levels or maybe sales levels that are most directly compensated. So that's one piece of evidence. Another piece of evidence is we always control for current performance. So it's always future performance that we're interested in, either future stock returns or future return on assets. And we always control for the current state of the company itself. The other thing that's interesting that we sort of bring up in the paper is, again, the beautiful thing about having a data set that's about all the employee beliefs, as opposed to, just targeted on purpose itself, is that we can strip out and look at the link across all these employee beliefs. So reverse causality should probably affect purpose camaraderie. It should probably affect overall engagement. It should probably affect trust in management. We have another factor that just captures how the quality that we think managers are. And really, even at controlling for all of that, this link persists, and it persists in a lead fashion, not a lagged fashion. So again, we don't have a perfect instrument here, but we say the totality of evidence is really consistent. If we had to sort of put our weight or a bet on one side or the other, it sort of has the flavor of a causal story.
Okay, that's right. That's really helpful. So I'd like to come to the second of the three papers we're going to discuss, the corporate purpose in public and private firms, where you look at how ownership structures affect your measure of purpose. So, well, let's get to the meat of it then. What did you find?
So we found a couple things that were really interesting. Firstly, there's really big differences.
Right.
So correlationally, there's really big differences in the strength of purpose by who the owners are. So the first big difference is when we just split up the companies between those that are publicly traded and those that are private, and even trying to match them on observables, size, industry, assets, etc. The sense of purpose is substantially stronger in private companies relative to public companies. And that difference is really accentuated the deeper in the organization that you go. So the executive level, the strength of purpose is about the same, but the deeper in the organization you go, the higher the gap is between public and private firms. So the lower sense of purpose, strength of purpose in public companies is driven by the middle and hourly ranks of the organization. So that's the sort of the headline finding of this paper.
And how do you explain that?
So it's interesting
relationship between ownership and purpose.
Yeah, this the mechanism that we focus on here, and I'll caveat this by saying we can pretty much explain half of this difference. So there's still a little bit of dark matter in this paper that's unexplained. But the mechanism that we talk about here is owner commitment, and back to the sort of relational contracting view that we turned to in the first paper. If you think about these implicit contracts, the owners are one side of this implicit contract. And so we look at owner commitment, and really what we find here is that the more committed the owners are, the higher the strength of purpose. So within publicly traded companies, the higher the proportion of dedicated to transient investors you have, the higher the sense of purpose. The higher the proportion of hedge fund owners that you have, the lower the sense of purpose. And then within private companies, when you split them up by private equity companies and everybody else, private equity companies look a lot like public companies. They have lower sense of purpose. So we sort of try to explain this by, the higher the owner commitment, the longer the duration that they're in for, those are the companies that we see a stronger sense of purpose. And the way that we think about this is, the more you can sort of invest in these intangible, hard to verify investments in both employees, but also in the type of actions that build purpose. If you think about, potentially R&D commitments or commitments to, longer horizon things that really build up employees' sense that the work that we're doing here is meaningful. That is, that it kind of makes sense, right? The more dedicated the owners you have, the more you can make these hard to contract investments that also correlate with purpose. And we see this played out in the governance structure of these companies too. So the companies that have a lower sense of purpose, they have more outsider CEOs. They incentivize these CEOs more on cost metrics and margin metrics than on growth and non-financial metrics. They engage more in M&A. And so there's real governance type of choices that correlate with this. And I will say, just because I know you want to move on to the third paper, there's an obvious treatment versus sorting question here, because even as I'm talking, you're like, well, of course, owners are not going to randomly sort to companies. So they're going to sort to companies that maybe, if you're an activist hedge fund, you're going to go to an underperforming company that's going to have a lower sense of purpose. That's, so there is this treatment versus sorting question here. And I won't get too much into it just for the purposes of time, but we take it really seriously in the paper. And we essentially argue that we think both is going on. So we see a matching effect, but we also tend to see a treatment effect here. So we argue that there is a treatment effect, even though there's also a matching effect that seems to be.
I mean, I'm glad you raised that point. I think it's a really important one to raise, because I think, the sort of naive readings of some of these papers could just lead people to say, oh, well, this proves that what we always need is long-term investors and we always need purposeful companies. And actually, that might kind of in aggregate be true, but actually there's really different kind of interesting substructure to the data. And that does bring us on to the third paper in the series, the most recent one, called The Contingent Relationship Between Purpose and Profit. And in some ways, I found this the most interesting, because you really start to tease some of this conditionality out. Can you explain for us briefly what you studied in this paper?
Yeah, this was a fun paper. It's actually the fastest out of the three of them. but I agree with you in some sense. From my perspective too, it's in many ways the most interesting one. So this paper was really sort of a response, I think, to how our first paper fit into the larger discussion on purpose. So what I found is that, so in the first paper, we found this average positive predictive role of purpose, right? Which is, the higher the purpose, the higher the performance. And as I was presenting this, I was noticing that this discussion on purpose was getting very polarized, right? There was either, and you can see this even, Larry Fink and BlackRock and a lot of the public discussion on purpose, there's sort of one camp that's very much, and I'm paraphrasing Larry Fink here, but he says something like, purpose and profits are intrinsically linked. Purpose is by no means opposed to profits, but it is the means by which profits are realized, right? And so there's sort of one camp that says, look, these always go together, they have to go together, and here's a paper that actually shows that they go together. And then there's another camp that was sort of polarized in the opposite direction, which is saying, this is greenwashing or nonsense or cheap talk, managerialism, and purpose is just a way of sort of covering up for agency issues. And when I was sort of in this debate in this room, in my mind, I'm like, look, sometimes it's going to be here, right, where sometimes purpose will be a means of enabling greater profits, and you see this right a lot, and then sometimes it's going to be here, and let's just be realistic that we're not in sort of a binary world here. And again, this is probably driven by the fact I'm in a strategy group. Strategy is all about variation across companies. So I wanted to show that empirically. And so in this paper, we basically say, look, let's take this average result from our first paper and unpack it and show when are purpose and profits complements and when are purpose and profits substitutes, when you have to choose.
And you found really wide heterogeneity in the link between purpose and financial performance, both across industries and between companies with different characteristics. And so what were the main dimensions that determine whether the relationship between purpose and profits holds or does not hold?
Yeah, so just very briefly in terms of that variation. So I think we found, I'm going to be trying to remember the stats off the top of my head, but something like purpose and profits are complements.
Exact numbers.
Yeah, you can go read the paper if you want to get the actual numbers. I think purpose and profits are positive complements for, I think, like 55% of the companies in our firm and about half the industries. And then they're either not related at all or negative for the rest. So, you still see the average relationship there, but I mean, it's like not at all, 100% of the R squared. I mean, there's many cases where they go opposed to each other. And so we found, or I emphasized, I found two big contingencies that sort of determine whether they go together or go apart. So the first big contingency is the degree to which the company relies on R&D or just intangibles, period. So the more a company is relying on R&D as a profit channel, the more purpose and profits are complements. And this makes a ton of sense. I mean, back to all the relational contracting stuff we've been talking about, right? So if you're a healthcare company or an innovation-based company, if you rely on extrinsic incentives alone, come join my biotech, I'll pay you a ton of money. That's going to be much less effective than come join my biotech. Let's go solve, an orphan disease that nobody else is looking at before. And I've seen this, I teach at a business school. I bring in CEOs to talk about, how they come up with strategies. You see this all the time. They rarely lead with money. They almost always lead with, what are we put on this planet to do? And why is that good? And why is that important? And that just fits with human psychology. We want to do things that are good and important in the world. So innovation-based companies, you see this positive relationship. You see it negative in companies that don't rely on R&D. Those companies tend to rely much, you see that the higher the purpose, the lower the profits. So that's one contingency. The second contingency that we found is back to ownership. So when you have dedicated owners, you tend to see purpose and profits as complements, and then more transient owners, purpose and profits are substitutes. And so the way we interpret this is there's sort of this interesting bundle out there of innovation-based, intangibles-based companies owned with long-term owners, driven by purpose, realizing superior performance. And then on the opposite, right, more cost-based companies driven by much more instrumental owners without a lot of R&D. You don't rely on purpose, you rely on other mechanisms to get profits. And sort of those are two viable bundles in the market that this paper finds.
And this is really fascinating. And taking all your work together, it is strongly suggestive of a link between purpose and profits, but you find this link depends on where in the organization the purpose is held, the ownership structure, but also the nature of the business and its ownership. And this really suggests that, you know, we can't just take a simplistic purpose is good view, and as you imply in the title of your most recent paper, it's contingent. And so, you know, you've described the fact that there are these clusters of situations where investment in purpose is more likely to pay off in others. So if you draw together the insight you've gained across all of your studies, I mean, what advice do you have for corporate leaders thinking about whether to invest in developing a purposeful culture in their organization?
So I think there's a couple pieces of advice here. The first is it has to be credible. And, you know, I saw this myself. You know, I mentioned before, I worked in consulting for 10 years, and I was in companies where purpose was credible, and then companies where that credibility was destroyed. And so the first piece of this is that all this, you know, sloganeering is really empty. And in order to really instill a credible purpose, you have to put tangible commitments behind it. It's your classic, you know, credible signaling story here. You have to invest in it. You have to do, you know, take costly actions in it. You have to show that you're committed to it. And then if your employees believe in it, you know, that's when you know that you've done something credible. And so that's one piece of advice. The other piece of advice is that, you know, and this is more on the policy side, but you know, it's very hard to mandate purpose. I think, you know, I don't know if our results show that per se, but they sort of imply that, right?
Well, they kind of imply that maybe you shouldn't mandate it, right? Because it's situational.
So this gets more to the purpose of the corporation debate here, but there's places where the market takes care of this, right? Where, you know, it benefit, you know, the long-term view benefits companies trying to do things important and meaningful for the world. And then there's context where that long-term view is not going to lead to, you know, important and meaningful, at least from the employee perspective. And that's where I think you need to think of other policy solutions besides just saying, you know, go forth and enact a purpose. So that's sort of one of the two of the punchlines of our decade-long
the body of work. I mean, and I think that's why I wanted to talk to you about this kind of body of work, because I think it's actually most interesting when viewed in aggregate rather than the individual papers. So Claudine, that was a fantastic discussion. Really thank you for taking the time to share your insights with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.